Hey y'all, Nick's here. Today I want to talk about how spells and spell damage scales. And it's going to be a little bit of a complicated topic. It involves a lot of math and understanding how um, carrying out an order of operations works when calculating damage. I'm going to do my best to explain it, but at the same time it's not exactly an easy task. So I hope I do fine, and if you don't understand what I'm talking about, by all means, it's a very hard concept to convey without being able to sit down with somebody and draw it on paper. But I'm going to do my best here because I think it's information that's worth having out there, just as a general guide for people making builds and trying to get things to work. So let's go ahead and start out here. I'm going to go ahead and show a lesser multiple projectiles gem. And this gem simply states 2 additional projectiles, 30% less projectile damage, and as it levels up, it will also gain increased projectile damage on top of it, 2 per level. So you'll see right now that this is a level 10 gem, so it's had 9 level ups, so it's had 9 instances of plus 2% increased projectile damage. Now, you may be asking why it says 18% increased projectile damage rather than just subtracting it from the 30% less projectile damage thing like Iron Will does, where it subtracts the cast speed. And the reason is because these are actually 2 completely separate game mechanics. The game handles them completely differently. And you'll see this with a lot of things. You'll see this with chain. Chain gives 50% less damage and scales up as it levels up as well. You'll see this with things like, I don't know if I have a leveled up GMP or not. Yeah, it's level 2. This has 2% increased projectile damage on top of it. So there are a lot of spells and abilities that utilize this, and I have a Google Docs graph that I went ahead and made specifically for this video to hopefully try and give a better sense of understanding for this. So we'll go ahead and bring that up and go from there. Alright, here we are in our spreadsheet. I'm going to try and do this as best as I can. First of all, we have our base damage. Let's assume we have a 100 damage fireball, right? Now, whenever you have something that increases your damage, that says increased damage, you might get increased spell damage on a wand or something. It just adds that into one big multiplier. So let's say we have 50% increased damage on our wand. We have 100% increased damage from our passive tree. We have a necklace that gives 10%. That's all just going to be added into one big number down here. So this makes sense. 1, 2, 2.5, 2.6, the number makes sense. And it takes our base and multiplies it by this number. And that gives us our total damage that our projectile deals. But let's go ahead and say that we start adding something like lesser multiple projectiles to it, right? That's 30% less damage. Makes sense. Base damage, just gets multiplied. But the way that the game handles more or less multipliers is different than increased or decreased multipliers. Instead of adding all of your more or less into one big net sum, it applies them individually, which means that the more less damage multipliers that you have, the more impact it's going to have on your base spell, and the more it's going to hurt that spell. Because let's go ahead and assume that we have a level 16 lesser multiple projectiles, and that gives 30% increased damage. We were talking about that earlier. One might think that they're going to cancel out, but because this gets multiplied by this, and then after that, this, and then any numbers that we add on top of it get applied to it, we see that our end damage is actually lower than our base damage. They don't cancel out, they're applied differently. Let's say we go ahead and add chain onto this, right? A level 16 chain will do the exact same thing. The multiplier is a bit different. And you'll see that it's just hurting our net damage much, much, much more. And the reason is because any multipliers that you have, we see we have a 1.6 multiplier, are affected by our more or less multipliers. And right now we have almost 1/3 effectiveness from our base and our increased damage multipliers. And that's just because the less multipliers apply to them separately, and they're not added into one. They just happen immediately after, and they're not affected by anything. And this means that per projectile, even though we have chaining fireballs, and we have 3 of them, per projectile we're going to be dealing less damage. And this is important when you're fighting things like bosses, because it means that you're not going to be dealing as much damage, because obviously you're not going to chain on a single boss. You're not going to be able to hit everything that you're shooting on a boss, unless it's a big boss like Vol or something. You can get close enough, but close enough to make them all hit on lesser mobs, but that's a bit risky. So the way that people handle dealing with these less mods is they just have a completely separate ability they use for single target on bosses. And they just apply gems that don't hurt that spell's damage, but rather make it better. Increased critical strike rating doesn't have a multiplier that has less or more on it. Or you could use something like melee physical damage, which has a multiplier that says more on it, which means that if you get any increased mods on it, that's going to add that much more to your increased because of when the multiplier applies to it. That's going to make your increased/decreased ratio better as opposed to worse if the wording is more, because it applies to everything. It scales off of everything if it says more or less. And that's just how people handle single target, because the AoE builds are obviously good. Even though the number is lower, you're sending out multiple projectiles that hit multiple times if you're using chain or whatnot. It's just, you have to consider the way that the game handles the spells. And I hope I made that clear. It's a bit hard to vocalize and explain, but hopefully somebody out there understands and somebody puts this information to good use. And I mean, if I failed, I'm sorry. I tried my best, but that's all I've got. And I'll see you tomorrow, and I hope you found this helpful.